I think there are still people joining us, but we should get started. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this online launch of What Makes an American Classic, a special issue of the New American Studies Journal. My name is Pantelis Michelakis, and as director of the Archive of Performances of Greek and Roman Drama, I'm pleased to host this launch and to welcome the editors of the issue, Caterina Domeneghini and Claire Barnes, several of the other contributors to the issue, and the four colleagues who have very kindly accepted the invitation to act as respondents, and with whom we will start: Wiebke Denecke, Glenn Most, Tessa Roynon, and Andrew Gross. I will be introducing them one by one as we go along. But let me just give you, before we get started with the first speaker, a sense of how we will proceed. And I think a couple of practical things I need to say regarding Zoom housekeeping. So we will start with the four respondents who will share with us their thoughts on what makes an American classic, starting with Wiebke. Then I will invite the two editors, Caterina and Claire, to respond to the responses. Then we will open up the discussion to other contributors to the volume, and we will conclude with a more general discussion that allows everyone to ask questions or post comments. So this Zoom webinar, which means that attendees will have their mics and cameras off by default to minimize background noise. If you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. The session will be recorded so that we can make it available for people who want to consult it at a later point via the APGRD's YouTube channel. And I think at this point we should include in the chat a link maybe to all the articles of the special issue. Is that something that maybe Claire or Kat could do for us?
Yes, I don't know.
Okay, so wonderful. So very briefly then to introduce Wiebke. Wiebke Denecke is professor of Chinese language and culture, professor of East Asian literatures and philosophies at MIT. She studies the literary and philosophical traditions of China, Japan, and Korea, comparative studies of East Asia and the pre-modern world, world literature, and the politics of cultural heritage and memory, and the transformation of the humanities in an age of STEM. She's founding editor-in-chief of the Shutan Library of Classical Chinese Literature and leads the MIT Comparative Global Humanities Initiative. Thank you for joining us today, Wiebke. I believe you are in Bonn this evening. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Pantelis. I'm so glad to have a chance to congratulate, in particular, the editors, but also all the authors whom I'm seeing here too, on this amazing achievement. I have to apologize right away. I'm in Bonn to give lectures this week, and at 6:15 sharp, the president here of the university is throwing a party for me, and I better show up. So I'm going to be probably handcuffed and taken away here, but I hope to make my remarks, and then I look forward to catching up with the discussion and everything that happened on the recording. So I really apologize that it happened this way. So I'm speaking today, giving these remarks really as somebody who has worked, from across Greco-Roman to East Asian as a classicist. And I was delighted when actually Pantelis contacted me and Kat and Claire regarding an article I'd written on what does a classic do, and introduced me to this special issue that is really a treasure box of wonders. I'm also glad that over the last month I've been scholar at Göttingen University, and this comes out of Göttingen University Press, which is, I'm proud that, Germans print these kind of things. And I'm the faculty lead of the Global Humanities Initiative at MIT, and we are honored to co-host this event today. So thank you so much, Pantelis, for making this possible. This special issue really marks a major milestone, and I feel this is more like a gut feeling, like a new phase. It's published at a memorable moment for America and the world. And I feel that, from the last decade of much more widespread kind of self-criticism and destruction of the classics field, especially in the US, I see here also a new reinvigoration and a realization of the potential of classics in very different ways for resistance, no? The Medea project shows that, for example, no? And I think this is so timely because the question of the classic or the classical is ever more pressing in the face of gross political co-optation. We cannot leave the classics to extremists. And that's why I'm so delighted to see that you are making a strong case for so many new uses, of classic and the classics. What I find particularly impressive is that your issue and the introduction is very inclusive. It's a very ecumenical intervention. If I might use a pun, it seems to me an opening of the mind about the American classic during the demise of the post-war Atlantic world order. So that's of great order. And your wide net really so broadly around the concept, phenomena, and practices. You have the classic, the classical. I always wonder about that in English. So interesting. What is the classic, the classical as adjectives? The classicist, classicism, classics, and you have academics, poets, critics, publishers, editors, social workers, and activists like the Medea Project. So it's very ecumenical, and in that sense, it's opening, no? I will now give you feedback more in the form of questions and food for thought. This doesn't need to be addressed in any way. It's more like food for thought. If it's helpful for the discussion, it's great. Otherwise, you can also just forget it. The first question is regarding the conceptual gain. And I would like to ask you, this is for the editors, but also for all the contributors. What did you discover in terms of specific inflections of the classic when thinking through America and with it? I see that this is coming up here and there, but I'm particularly interested in the institutional incarnations. You'll see what I mean by that. And I wonder in particular about the distinctive traits of the classical in America as a form of the new Rome. There have been so many new Romes after 410 when Western Rome fell. And this contrasts very strongly with China, which has never really fallen as an empire in 1911, you can say. But in many ways, there was no 410. There was even no fall of the Eastern, of the Eastern Empire of China, but it has always been there. And in that sense, the European dynamic is so different because everybody tried to redo Rome in some ways, for many, many centuries. But America is also the pop culture capital, and I think that makes it very distinctive. And so I wonder even about things like, sorry to say that, when I came to the US to study, I loved that there's a classic rock station. I have never seen that in in Germany or, in Europe. And they are classic cars. There's like the classic that's very different from the classical. That's very American, it seems to me, Also, what seems to me distinctive, but that's again a question, it's more like a gut feeling, it's not my field, that the US as a country has earned the classic more quickly. You have to earn the classic. You just don't get it so quickly. We all know that. Has earned it more quickly than anybody else in world history. In the introduction, you bring the example of D.H. Lawrence, who in 1923, already as a revision when he came to the US, published studies in classic American literature. And a lot of classic American literature hadn't even happened yet. It was very quick, it was already kind of classic. So I wonder how does that relate? And again, to the conceptual gain, classy, classic, classical, all different adjectives in English. And I wonder about that, what's distinctive there and what kind of conceptual you get from that, thinking through America with a classic. Now, the next thing is about institutions and America. And there you have a wonderful article here about great books, courses, and liberal arts education. But one thing that's so important in thinking about the classics is that world literature might be a term from Goethe, but it's not really practiced in Europe. As an institutional incarnation, it is liberal arts education and the great books courses that really do that, no? And I wonder, what that really means. And I would have loved to say more here. I will soon have to leave because I'm also one of the editors of the Norton Anthology of World Literatures, world literature that picked up basically from Eliot's, the Dr. Eliot's 5-foot shelf that you talk about. And there's an entire article about that. In the 1950s, Norton started actually publishing a world literature anthology. Only in the 1990s did we become really more kind of global. But I wonder, like, you pick it up more from a historical perspective, but it is so important that liberal arts education in the US makes the classical something that's much more part of in a global way, of general education in the US as opposed to Europe, for example, and many other countries. So in that sense, I wonder, what you think about, like, what the potential is really for great books courses, not as projects that have already kind of fallen to some degree, but the Norton Anthology of World Literature, every 4 years we have a new edition, and it's new. It has a lot of new things that adjust to the canon by the definition of Guillory, and also, that you brought in your introduction. And the last 2 points, and then the president is going to pick me up here, is America is in many ways the convener of classical philologies. It's a treasure house and a brain trust of a lot of philology of many different world cultures and many different languages. Things that have died much more in the humanities cuts, for example, in Germany, in Europe. And there's a whole new comparativism emerging from people doing, pre-modern India and China and, the Americas and this and that. And where America really has an important role because there are many places still where this is being studied. It's also the home where the bilingual libraries, like the Loeb Library 100 years ago, the Murty Library for Classical India now, my Shutang Library, which I founded for East Asia, is actually anchored and founded. And I think there's a reason that it's coming out of America now. So in that sense, America produces other classical traditions and classical studies in many ways. And that's not so visible in the, of course, in the issue because there are other focuses. But I wonder, and this is my closing question here, in China right now, there's a huge humanities boom. There's so much money for the humanities, and the classics play a huge role. There are a lot of programs that compare European and Chinese and other classics. There's an article in a recent special issue I did called Shared Paths for Shared Futures that actually examines this. I'll put that into the chat when I finish. But where exactly it is described how in China right now, they massively build up comparative world philology and kind of literature, big books courses and research, and where there's going to be big competition coming out of a certain, of course, political angle. And where I wonder, this is just, kind of a fun suggestion. I know you're probably really exhausted having done your special issue, but might you think of a follow-up volume where you actually think about, like, how American philologists of the world's many different traditions and cultures now, in thoughtful and firm democratic dialogue with non-Western world powers and their own claims to world classics, like in China and India, how they can make the classic and the world classics into a fountainhead of understanding of the human experience now and then, and to create a new global comparative knowledge of the classics to all cultures and times, and really kind of being, bringing an attention to the fact that classics are emerging now, world classics, from places that have very strong national agendas and political agendas, and where America so far has been the place to really make this into a project for humanity rather than of particular nations. So if you are interested in doing something like that, just let me know. I would love to contribute or do something in that, because that's something I'm very much involved in myself, working in China a lot, and where I feel that we really need to pick up the slack, and talk back really from a firmly grounded, meticulous philological and historical studies that's not coming out of politics. I'll end it here. Sorry to end it. Have a great event and all the best. And really, my heartfelt congratulations again. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Wiebke, for joining us, for making time in what has been a very busy day for you. Enjoy your evening. We will be in touch.
Thank you very much. And I'll put into the chat the article I mentioned because I think that's so few people in classics know about what's happening in China. And I think that's an important thing. I put it in the chat if you're interested in this. Take care.
That's
Bye-bye.
wonderful. Thank you again. Thank you.
Congratulations. Bye-bye.
Okay, so any thoughts or questions that people begin to formulate, we will not address them until later in the session, but if you wish to share them already, please make use of the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we can go through as many of them as we can later on. Okay, so moving on to Glenn. Glenn was until not so long ago, was 2020 or something like that, professor of Greek philology at the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa. And he remains a regular visiting professor on the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, and an external scientific member of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. He has published books on a very wide range of topics in classics, ancient philosophy, the history and methodology of classical studies, comparative literature, the history of religion, literary theory, the history of art. He's currently working on a number of different projects involving both ancient Greek philology and the comparison of philological practices in different periods and cultures throughout the world. Glenn, over to you.
Pantelis, thank you very much for your gracious introduction. It's, on the one hand, very easy to say wonderful things about this special issue that Claire and Kat have put together. It's, on the other hand, difficult to follow Wiebke, who has given such a wonderful introductory talk and has raised all kinds of interesting questions. I'm going to speak briefly about one set of issues that seems to me to be expressed with remarkable clarity in the journal issue as a whole, and that is to say the paradoxes and tensions that are inherent in the very notion of an American classic. As Wiebke said, few cultures are as obsessed with classics as American culture is, but and not only in the sense of classic rock and classic automobiles, but also, as Susan's article showed, in the extraordinary stakes in the current discussion about the use of the classics for specific ideological issues. It's hard to imagine any other country in the world in which arguments about classics would have such violence and such weight as they do in America. And yet, America is a profoundly unclassical country. America was made up out of people who, with the exception, the crucial exception of the Blacks and the indigenous Americans, had rejected willingly the models that they had inherited from traditional cultures and had come to a country where they felt free to establish a new life. This is true of the heretical Protestants who started coming in the 17th and 18th century, of the waves of European immigration that started in the same period. They didn't want a classical country. They wanted to get away from the classicals and to found something new. But the country that they founded ended up appealing from the very beginning to older paradigms and very often to Greek and Roman paradigms. This is certainly the case of the founding fathers, and it was the case throughout American history, so that America was both an anti-classical country and a classical country. It sought to do things new, but it also sought to have its own classics. One expression for this was the American interpretation of the ancient model of democracy, in which the American veered constantly from the extreme of a kind of populism to the extreme of a kind of elitist democracy. And both could appeal to classical precedents, to Thucydides, to Plato, to Cicero. There was a kind of translatio imperii that brought the progress of the world from Jerusalem to Rome, and then to Western Europe, and then from there across the Atlantic to the United States, where manifest destiny then brought it through the rest of the country to California. California being both the most anti-classical and the most classical part of the United States. The two essays that I have been asked to focus above all on, those by Constanze Gutenke and by Susan Hagemann, focus upon these issues in the paradoxes and tensions of the American classic in a particularly fascinating way. Constanze's essay on the tension between classics as a humanizing discipline and classics as a research discipline concentrates above all on the 19th century, but moves into the 20th century as well. She talks about Basil Gildersleeve and Paul Shorey, and in particular about a figure who certainly deserves much more attention than she's received in the past, namely Helen McGill, the first woman to have received a PhD in classics. All of these people talk about nightingales in an interesting way, but all of them see a kind of tension between the classical civilizing, humanizing impulse and the research that actual classics departments engage in. Helen McGill suffered from that tension much more than Paul Shorey or Basil Gildersleeve did. For me, and I'm sure for Constanze as well, this American case is very reminiscent of a tension that is typical of 19th century German classics as well, the tension between different aspects of the Humboldtian model. On the one hand, when Wilhelm von Humboldt wanted to found the University of Berlin, he appealed to Goethe's notion of the humanizing, general, civilizing effect of the classics. But on the other hand, he saw the university not only as a teaching institution, but also as a research institution, unlike his predecessors who had divided teaching for the university from research for the academies. The result was an ever-growing tension in the 19th century in Germany between appeals to the civilizing effect of classics and recognition of the hard, dusty work that was done by classicists in their daily endeavors. Nietzsche is one of the most prominent classicists who recognized this tension and pointed out to its disadvantages. What I wonder about is how the American situation, which Constanze describes so beautifully, is different from the German one. I think that the main difference is that in Germany, studying classics was a way to get a job in the administration of government, and therefore that research was justified not because of the contents of what you learned, but because of the method and the moral disposition that was involved in scientific research. Namely, you learned to follow orders, you learned to discipline yourself, and you learned to write clearly. In America, where studying classics didn't have that outcome, classics was exposed to currents of populism and pragmatism and had a harder time in justifying research. Susan Hagemann gives what I could describe as a bulletin from the battlefield of the American cultural wars. She has done an enormous amount of really helpful work to indicate the links and connections between well-known and less well-known figures in American politics. I find her report not only sobering, I didn't need to be sobered up, but I found it sobering, but also rather frightening. It describes a crisis that we are all familiar with in general terms and in its impact on us and on people that we know, and whose prospects are not clear. My hopes for the future are directed not only to the midterm elections, for which I am worried about whether the Democrats will manage to get it together, but more generally, for my hopes are directed to the cleverness of students and teachers who always find ways to work around the rules that people impose upon them. And above all, for the ability of all texts, and not only Greek and Roman ones, to resist ideological misappropriation. So I think that there is some hope, but the hope requires vigilance and requires discussion, and it requires the study of journal issues like the one that Claire and Kat have done. What that issue shows us is a tradition that is up for grabs, and we have to grab it. Thank you very much to both of them and to the authors of this wonderful collection.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Once again, much to think about, and I'm sure that people will have thoughts that they will want to share. Please wait a little bit more. We will try and identify what's the best way to proceed with questions and comments at the end. Feel free to make use of the Q&A button to place any thoughts that you have in a waiting room where we will visit them later on. I would like to introduce our third respondent now, Tessa Roynon, who is a literary scholar, writer, and librarian. She taught at the University of Oxford for a number of years. She's a specialist in modern American literature, particularly American African writing and classical reception. She's the author of the Cambridge Introduction to Toni Morrison, the prize-winning Toni Morrison and the Classical Tradition, and the Classical Tradition in Modern American Fiction. She's also the co-editor of African Athena, New Agendas, Ovid and Postmodernism in the 21st Century, and Global Ralph Ellison. She currently works as the founding librarian at the Swan School, which is a new and diverse comprehensive school in Marston, Oxford. Her most recent publication is an article which I think has just come out in the Book Collector, in which she argues that major US libraries are remiss for not curating the works that Toni Morrison commissioned and edited at Random House in the late 1960s as a special collection in their own right. Tessa, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I want to start by congratulating Caterina and Claire, along with others and the contributors, on the publication of this fascinating collection, and to thank them for giving me this enriching opportunity to read it carefully and to think. I'm impressed by the sheer scope and the breadth of the endeavour, its variety of subject matter and format, and the ambition and urgency of the questions that it raises, and by the way the chapters reflect and refract each other. In my current role as a secondary school librarian, I can only echo Alexander Manchell's point about the high school as an intense site of contestation about the classic. Having spent the last 5 years developing a book collection for 1,000 diverse teenagers, suffice it to say that the questions about inclusion and exclusion and about the role of the arts and of reading in democracy that animate this volume also animate my workplace every day. I also deeply appreciate the forum format of this journal, its flexibility and capaciousness, the poetry and the interviews, and the conversations and the commentaries that are interwoven with the scholarly essays. Academia is supposed to be about community and dialogue, and this format really helps to make that aspiration a reality. I want to express an appreciation for the editor's introduction. The focus on Calvino and D.H. Lawrence is profoundly productive. It made me realize that I don't think I've ever encountered, aside from William Carlos Williams, an attentive engagement with Lawrence's strange little book before now, itself a perfect example of an overlooked and subversive classic. I especially like the editor's emphasis on the importance of flux and fluidity in classicness. This made me think, of course, of Ovid and the Metamorphoses. One of the many things about the Metamorphoses that speaks so powerfully to us today is its refusal of binaries and polarities. Taking a cue from both Ovid and Toni Morrison, I would say it's crucial for both the classics and democracy that we take a both and approach, that we think about multiplicity and paradox rather than direct opposition or juxtaposition. Any classic worth that name cannot be reduced to a binary opposition. That is an essential part of what Caterina and Claire draw attention to in their brilliant closing emphasis on classic strangeness. I made a special request to the editors to respond to Emily Coyte's essay on the controversy surrounding the creation of the Harvard Classics in 1909, and I'm so glad I did. This is a fascinating story. Anecdotally, Dr. Eliot's contentious decision to omit the Bible and Shakespeare, because everyone already owned and read them, reminded me of the BBC Radio 4 program Desert Island This. On this program, after naming the soundtrack of their life, a celebrity has to choose one luxury and one book to take with them to a desert island. Even now, in this program's 83rd year, the castaway does not need to choose either the Bible or the complete works of Shakespeare, because, much to the wrath of many, these are always and already provided as a given, viewed as a necessity and not a luxury. I particularly appreciated Emily's interpretation of the Harvard Classics controversy as an exemplification of the inadequacies of the categories of highbrow, middlebrow, and lowbrow. The porousness of these distinctions made itself evident in my own archival research on the fascinating reading habits, education, and intellectual formation of modern American novelists who engaged classical antiquities, such as Willa Cather, William Faulkner, Ralph Ellison, and Marilyn Robinson. I also need to celebrate the final sentence of Emily's article. I think we can all agree that academic writing does not always leave us wanting more, but this is an exception. I quote, "The controversy about inclusion in the contents of the set is merely a beginning," Emily writes, and it points towards controversies about inclusion in the democratic citizenry, end quote. For me, this is a veritable cliffhanger. Emily, I'm truly eager for the next installment. Emily and I share an interest in the relationship between reading classics and identity, and between reading classics and power. My latest book looks at, among other things, how select modern American fiction writers allude within their own novels to classical books as objects. F. Scott Fitzgerald is a prime example here. In the penultimate chapter of his 1934 novel, Tender is the Night, the now unmoored Dick Diver dismisses Mary North's well-intentioned advice to him as, quote, one of Dr. Eliot's classics. In belittling both her moral wisdom and the Harvard Classics series, Dick suggests that Western civilization is of no use to him now. Fitzgerald thus signals that the aloneness and homelessness of his erstwhile hero are complete. For the young Ralph Ellison, on the other hand, the Harvard Classics were apparently formative. In his 1964 essay, Hidden Name and Complex Fate, Ellison reflects on the importance of his reading as a teenager. Quote, "I read my first Harvard Classics," he says, "in the home of a friend whose parents were products of the stream of New England education which had been brought to Negroes by young and enthusiastic white teachers after the Civil War." This motif of reading other people's books, of reading wherever books can be found, is a recurring motif in my research into modern American fiction writers' encounters, when they themselves were young people, with the classics. I have here to mention Willa Cather, an often overlooked writer of strange, poised, minimalist classics, which are brilliantly classically elusive, and whom I was overjoyed to see name-checked by Joseph Horowitz in this volume. And then in his wonderful discussion of Amy Clampett with Constance Everett Pipe, William Spiegelman asks of the 1940s, how many Iowa farm boys majored in classics? Let's not forget that Willa Cather, though not quite a farm girl, grew up in the rural Nebraskan small town of Red Cloud, but nonetheless studied Latin, Greek, English, and French at the University of Nebraska, graduating in 1895. And before her university years, she read copiously in neighboring families' personal libraries, learned her ancient Greek from a local storekeeper called William Ducker in the late 1880s, and as a small child was read to by her grandmother from a compendium that mixed up American Greek, Roman, and biblical heroes with gay abandon. This was called Peter Parley's Universal History. Cather too depicted the prairie grass as a Homeric ocean in her brilliant 1918 novel, My Antonia, and in her 1923 novel, A Lost Lady, a disillusioned young male protagonist discovers he can live, quote, a double life by secretly reading through the Byrne Classics series in his uncle's book collection. These classics, he believes, are, quote, living creatures. Returning to one of Emily's central insights about the Harvey classics, which one of us can demarcate the highbrow, the middlebrow, and the lowbrow when it comes to Willa Cather's classicism? Caterina and Claire also invited me to respond to the cultural commentary section of the volume. Joseph Horowitz's impassioned defense of the arts in the face of entertainment's tsunami-like devastation actually linked immediately in my own mind with Susan Hageman's account of conservative classical education in the USA. I hope these contributors do not mind if one part of my response to them is to say, do not despair. I do not mean to be glib when I say that if young people are being forced to read the Odyssey and Toni Morrison, then this can surely, from one perspective, give us hope. There must be worse fates than this, so long as, in Edward Frank's great phrase, these students are allowed to shun the simulacra and read the real stuff. The terrifying problem that Hageman draws attention to is surely not the classics themselves, those strange, subversive, irrepressible beasts, but what she calls, quote, the packaging, or in the Morrisonian phrase, the fabrication. I honestly believe that so long as students are taking the Odyssey into their hands and are directly encountering this great art, then the creation of a hermetically sealed package is impossible. Not every individual will break free, of course, but enough of them will do, for sure. No one puts this better than Percival Everett in this volume. He says states in the US can ban books if they like, but they cannot stop art. Before I move on to a few more remarks about Steptoe and Everett, I also need to mention Marilynne Robinson. Everyone should read everything she wrote. Both her fiction and her nonfiction deploy both Athens and Jerusalem to incomparable emancipatory effect. There's no surer way to diminish the power of conservative Christian fundamentalism and populism than through her classically elusive and deeply religious writing. There is no stranger and more estranging classic in the world than her 1980 novel, Housekeeping. It's an honor to respond to Robert Burns Steptoe's beautiful meditation on James, because it gives me the opportunity to appreciate not just his insights here, but his lifelong contribution to African American literary studies over the decades. Steptoe's illumination of the importance of naming, of literacy, of books, of writing in Everett's novel is of course indisputable. I think I find the text to be a little more ironic, deliberately trite about the conveniently discovered paper and ink and books and pencil than Steptoe does, a bit more deliberately absurd, Afro-pessimist and Afro-futurist at the same time. Everett brings an implicit and harshly comedic perspective into view on Frederick Douglass's comment in his 1845 narrative. Quote, my feet have been so cracked with the frost that the pen with which I am writing might be laid in the gashes. And while Everett also pays homage, even as he devastates and revises it, to the unbound strangeness of the novel Huckleberry Finn itself, Steptoe's emphasis on names and naming allowed me to notice a crucial line spoken by Huck in Everett's first chapter. I heard tell there are names for different blues. I heard tell there are names for different blues. The pun on blues in this phrase perfectly illuminates what I want to say about African American cultural production, classics, and Horowitz's exhortation to use the past. I have said that what keeps classics strange is the direct encounter between art and its audience or reader. But a classic is also surely defined by its capacity for being remade and revised, a process which often illuminates and revivifies the essential classic strangeness while also doing something importantly new. This is a very obvious point, but African American artists and writers and intellectuals have always excelled in using the past to insist on their identity and their power. I recently read Laura Helton's fantastic history of Black American book collectors, bibliophiles, and librarians. It's called Scattered and Fugitive Things. If you want an uplifting read, choose that. If you want to encounter the strangeness of Euro-American classicism cast in relief, look at Carrie Mae Weems' visual art, in particular the Louisiana Project, in which she simply positions herself in a neoclassical slave plantation landscape. Or read Robin Costa Lewis's haunting found epic, The Voyage of the Sable Venus. If you want to see a master of classical illusion in action, look at what Ralph Ellison does with Ovid's account of Icarus and of Phaeton in his unfinishable 3 days before the shooting. Or at the other end of the spectrum, if you want to be haunted forever by a quietly devastating memoir, read Lucille Clifton's Generations, originally commissioned and edited by Morrison in 1976, reissued as a New York Review of Books classic in 2021. This wonderful journal issue was full of fabulous calls to action, so I'm going to close by adding a few of my own. These really only illuminate and reiterate the key themes already stated by the contributors of this work. Do fight the ways in which classics get packaged or fabricated, but don't fight the classics themselves. Cherish the classics and yes, use the past. Read Ovid, use Ovid, fixate on the metamorphoses, read all the hundreds of versions and adaptations of it that are out there. Protect and bring to the center those thousands of classics, those strange subversive works of art that by definition get exiled to the margins. Support the structures that get kids reading. Put books into young people's hands. In the US, fight book bans. In the UK, fight public library closures. Join the Great School Libraries campaign. It's not a statutory requirement in the UK for a secondary school to have a library. How can this possibly be true? Follow the example of my former colleague at Oxford, a classicist, who donated their entire £1,000 annual allocation of OUP books to my school's library in its opening term. And yes, ban the use of cell phones or mobiles in schools. This sets kids free. Phones are banned in the school where I work, and kids come to their library in their social times and they read every day. With Willa Cather's idea of classics as living creatures in mind, I'm going to close with a quotation from Toni Morrison's inimitable Nobel Lecture in Literature of 1993. At the beginning of her lecture, Morrison recounts the myth or the folktale of the two naive and overconfident young women who tried to play a trick on a blind and wise old black woman. They stand before her, these young people, and one of them says, "Old woman, I hold in my hand a bird. Tell me if it is living or dead." She does not answer, and the question is repeated. "Is the bird I'm holding living or dead?" The old woman's silence is so long, the young people have trouble holding their laughter. Finally, she speaks, and her voice is soft but stern. "I don't know," she says. "I don't know whether the bird you are holding is alive or dead. But what I do know is that it is in your hands. It is in your hands."
Thank you so much, Tessa, for your thoughtful reflections. Much appreciated. I will introduce at this point our final respondent, the editor-in-chief of the New American Studies Journal, Andy Gross, Professor of American Literature and Culture at the University of Göttingen, which hosts the journal. Andy has previously held positions at the University of Erlangen, at the John F. Kennedy Institute in Berlin, and at the University of California, Davis. Andy, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I want to start also by thanking Kat and Claire and just saying what a pleasure it was to work with them, just from a kind of an editorial perspective, how really great an experience it was for the whole team. And I'll just quote one of my fellow editors who said at the end of this process, "The future of the profession is in good hands." So thank you for that. I have to start for a second time by saying that I really didn't know I was going to be a respondent. I thought I was going to be more of a salesman and kind of talk about the journal to you and its history and its position and what we're trying to do. But that history is so wrapped up in the history of American studies in Germany after the war. And I think that the history of American studies after World War II in Germany is a part of what makes an American classic in Germany, that maybe I'll be telling the same story at the same time, though a little spontaneous and a little bit unprepared. Now, this doesn't mean to say that American studies is a post-war phenomenon doesn't mean that there wasn't American studies beforehand. I remember doing some research in the Kennedy Institute Library, a Ford Foundation library built after the war, but it held collections that dated to time previous to that, including that awful little book by T.S. Eliot, After Strange Gods, which he tried to suppress in the post-war years for its anti-Semitic remarks. I remember coming across that book, opening it up, finding the Nazi stamp in the beginning, in the frontispiece, which had been crossed out by a subsequent librarian, And then coming across those infamous lines where he talks about not having too many Jews in any society, and somebody had underlined it in a thick pencil and written in the margin, here, here. The only annotation in the book, I might add, but somebody had made a point of doing that. But of course, American studies after the war in Germany is very different. And it was like that Ford Foundation Library, funded and to some extent strongly influenced by the United States and by the embassies and by the cultural politics of the post-war years. The journal started out in that way. It was originally in the early 1960s a newsletter, which was written for teachers of American studies in gymnasium, so in the secondary level, and it was financed by the State Department. Didn't cost very much money. This was a mimeograph journal, but over the years, that financing stayed consistent until the journal moved over to the University of Göttingen about 10 years ago, when we cut ourselves off from, it was enough funding to pay for a host, an internet host for the web page, and to pay a student editor to help with a little bit of the copy editing. But that is to say that the history of American studies in Germany is bound up with American foreign policy and American politics, and of course that came under a hefty criticism in the 1960s, both in the United States and in Germany, when this was seen as an arm of the cultural Cold War. The American classics, if you will, that had been studied in Germany at that time, the classic, of course, would have been Moby Dick, a book famously misread by the RAF, but misread by them because it was so widely read. And that's not to say that everything that would have counted as a classic in the United States at the time was counting as a classic in Germany. Quite the contrary. I recently did a couple issues of the Wallace Stevens Journal, and the German poets discovered William Carlos Williams right after the war. Wallace Stevens didn't become popular until the 1990s for various internal reasons and for associations in the East and West that Stevens must simply be too bourgeois to be a poet. That wasn't really reconsidered until later. But the classics were literature that was supposed to teach people how to be free, literature that was supposed to teach people how to be democratic. The point of studying American studies in Germany was to educate or re-educate a generation of Germans, or many generations of Germans, on how to embrace democratic forms of government. That became questioned in the 1960s during the student rebellions for reasons similar to the U.S. So with the irony that German students would take to the streets chanting things like USA SS while wearing Levi's jeans and listening to the Doors, right? So the cultural influence of the United States was always a little bit different than the political meaning, and that lasts until today, with the conditions being very, very different. But one of the things, and this is an old story, but one of the things that the Cultural Revolution, one of these things that this revolt against American hegemony, especially against the Vietnam War, against race politics, and sympathy with the Civil Rights Movement, but also against the way American studies was being taught in Germany. One of the issues was the suspicion that even when American literature seemed democratic, it was hypocritically democratic. And it wasn't speaking to the truth of what was happening in the United States. In other words, it was ideological. And this is a word that's come up by many of the respondents already. American literature, when it preached freedom, was hypocritical at best, ideological at worst, because of course its own history, the genocidal actions against the indigenous people, the enslavement of people from overseas to come and work, these things gave the lie to democracy and to the very notion of freedom. Listening to the other commentators, to several of you, made me realize that perhaps one of the things that defines a classic is its resistance to ideological capture. What it does is, in spite of the fact that you can claim that Moby Dick is an ideological text, that Americans are more Ahab than Ishmael, that the novel won't let itself be reduced to that it keeps coming back for more. And I think that one of the great things about this issue is that it points that out again and again, that some of the texts that haven't been read for political reasons insist on being read. They force themselves to be read, even as we just heard in Tessa's talk, even if classics are being assigned for ideological reasons, they resist that kind of ideological capture. So I'll stop here with my unprepared introduction. And just once again, thanks, Kat, and thanks to Kat and Claire. One more plug in my role as salesman for the New American Studies Journal. We are a kind of a shoestring operation. We have embraced this notion of forum and dialogue. We're experimenting with other forms, with shorter forms that have more respondents, that have more possibilities to answer back. This wonderful launch is exactly, grist for the mill. This is exactly the kind of thing that we're after. We're also open to proposals for special issues. If anybody has anything in mind, or the sequel that's already been pushed upon you, Claire and Kat, would certainly be interested in that. And in terms of our essayistic contributions, we try to be more Raritan than PMLA, shorter, more essayistic, all the more important now that Raritan is closing down. So thanks again to our special issue editors, and thanks for inviting me today.
That's great, Andy. Thank you so much. So at this point, I would like to invite Kat and Claire to share with us their thoughts on the responses we've had on the special issue. I have been asked to keep my introduction of them super brief, so I will do as I'm told. Both of them working at the intersection of classics and English. Claire writing up her DPhil in classical reception on Christopher Logue, K. Tempest, and E.M. Forster. Kat recently completed her DPhil on the mass market series, The Everyman's Library. Kat and Claire, was that brief enough for you?
That was perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, we wanted to keep this bit relatively snappy so that we can get on to hearing from our wonderful contributors. I realize we're ambiguously presenting under the same name, so I'm Claire. We're both going to be offering a couple of responses. But yeah, first of all, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the APGRD for hosting. Thank you for wonderful, thought-provoking and considered responses from our three respondents, and to your really kind words, Andy, as well. Yeah, thanks to you and everyone at NASJ for allowing two Europeans loose on the topic of the American classic. We're just going to give a little bit of background about how this project came about, sort of what our motivations have been within it, and then maybe start to kind of introduce a few more questions maybe that could be picked up when we get to the more open conversation. So Kat and I first began working together in 2021. We met and realized that in our own research, we were circling around quite similar questions. How do classics with a big and a small c interact? How might a more inclusive phenomenology of the term be explored, particularly in relation to consumerism, and in light of contemporary discourse around the exclusionary narratives at work within our discipline? And this collaborative project has always had an explicitly interdisciplinary focus. Classic means different things to different people. Different disciplines have their own classics. In 2023, we co-hosted a workshop on that subject here in Oxford. We brought together early career researchers from English, classics, modern languages, theology, and music. And then, as now, we were quite keen to challenge our own institutional biases. So looking both beyond literature, which is our comfort zone, and beyond the Anglosphere as well. Our keynote was Glenn Most, with Constanza Gutenker as a respondent. So it's a real pleasure to have both of them back in different guises this evening.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kat, and I would also like to extend my gratitude to Andy, to the respondents, and to our wonderful contributors for their excellent interventions. I'm going to talk about our experiences with publishing with the journal. What Claire described as this eclectic postgraduate discussion in the seminar room gradually evolved into a more focused idea for a special journal issue. I first came across New American Studies Journal through my friend and editorial board member, James Dothwaite. And New American Studies Journal, as James first presented it to me, seemed like a great venue for a project that aimed to bring together the classic and the modern, as well as voices from within and outside the academy. Given Claire's and my own shared interest in the institutions that make world classics, from publishing to theatre, we saw great value in inviting poets, literary critics, and performance to join a conversation alongside scholars and PhD students from universities across the globe. The question of the classic continues to generate interest in both specialist and non-specialist circles, as our respondents have noted. Since publication of this issue in early 2025, we've witnessed several signs of this renewed engagement, from Percival Everett's novel James, which Robert Steptoe has kindly reviewed for our issue, receiving the Pulitzer Prize, to the critical attention devoted to the Cambridge Centennial edition of The Great Gatsby, to Jill Lepore's essay in The New Yorker, recounting her attempt to read 100 classics during the first 100 days of Trump administration. This cultural and critical amalgam speaks directly to recent developments in classical reception and reception studies more broadly, as critical orientations and evolving practices that intersect with literary sociology, translation and media study, the history of reading and of the book, and many other fields. The scope of the journal demanded that we made an intervention primarily in American literary studies, and we thought that reframing the age-old question, what is a classic, in a way that attends to the material and institutional forces underpinning its formation in a North American context seemed both timely and imperative, especially in the current political climate where when the country is becoming increasingly isolationist and more inward looking. America, to paraphrase Jhumpa Lahiri's Translating Myself and Others, where she draws on the Ovidian myth of Echo and Narcissus, is at risk of becoming a nation that flees its echoes, a culture that is turned inward, in love with itself or with the idea of itself. And we believe that diagnosing the processes by which certain books, artists, or even ideas come to be considered great would be a first crucial step in recovering those echoes and silenced voices. We're also acutely aware of the limitations that such a localized geographical focus brings, of course, and we are very grateful to our respondents for their reading recommendations and for suggesting compelling avenues for further research. We are indebted to Wiebke's article, What Does a Classic Do?, that she mentioned at the beginning, which alongside her response draws our attention to the divergent worldviews that arise from different etymological, literary, and phenomenological traditions. The so-called Western tradition, on the one hand, ties the scriptor classicus tightly to socioeconomic status, whereas in Chinese literary traditions, for example, the classic instead evokes a cosmological and political order devoid of this class dimension. And no history of the classical would be complete without an attempt to navigate these tensions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think articles such as Wiebke's really highlight the fact that as soon as you start to take an interdisciplinary or cross-cultural collaborative approach, you have to immediately relieve yourself of or disabuse yourself of the comfortable notion that the classic is a timeless monolith. So to borrow the title of our contributor, Rochelle Gerstein's book, classic art is more often than not written in water. And recognizing this subjectivity invites, I think, consideration of who and what is at play in the creation of the classic or of classical status. And then that invites a question of how to respond next, both in terms of what kind of art to platform and also how to handle existing works to which that canonical status has already been ascribed. And yeah, as all of our respondents have pointed out, this feels quite pertinent, particularly at the moment. Many of our journal contributors and respondents this evening or morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, have either explicitly or implicitly alluded to this contemporary iteration of the culture wars and how it's waged in libraries and on school curricula. So the section of the journal that we've titled Classical Liberal Education and Its Discontents pairs two voices, Hageman and Gutenke, as discussed by Glenn Most in his response, looking at these themes of the classic, of classicism, and the formation of cultural notions of greatness or otherwise alongside educational institutional structuring. As mentioned, this was picked up in Glenn's response and also by Tessa just now. And I'm very interested in Tessa's call to keep classics strange by encouraging more direct encounters and revisions between art and reader. Her note to avoid conflating the packaging with the art feels very relevant when one considers some of the work discussed in the journal. So, for instance, Nancy Rabinowitz's conversation with Rodessa Jones and troupe members from the Medea Project, Theatre for Incarcerated Women HIV Circle. And in that interview, I was particularly taken by core member Lisa Frias's comment. She says that the project is, and I quote, not only utilizing myth as a driving force for the evolution of our work, it's also a place at the table for people who have historically been excluded from it. It's sort of like reclaiming the right to have something to say about classical literature. I think that's a very valuable thing to reiterate. Kind of coming at this from a similar angle, we also had an interview with Alexander Manchel, who's unfortunately not able to join us this evening. And we reprinted an excerpt from his book, Writing Backwards, Historical Fiction and the Shaping of the American Canon. And he introduced the specific role of historical fiction in contributing to not only canonical literature, but also shaping understandings of nationhood and relationships with the past. And in one section, he talks about a necessary shift in understandings of historical events, which happens when, for instance, Native American voices are recentered in literary depictions of, in this case, World War II. He says, it's not just about working to include Native people in the historical record of the war, but also arguing that such inclusion requires a necessary revision of that record.
And this form of revision is what Glenn Most himself has described as a tradition up for grabs, and is exemplified, of course, particularly well by the role of the publishing industry, something that Claire and I have explored in our own research, as well as through our close collaboration with Emily Coit and Edwin Frank, publisher of New York Review of Books Classics. Both Tessa and Wiebke in their responses have highlighted the significance of book series in the dissemination of world literature in translation. Wiebke has mentioned the Loeb Classical Library, while Tessa has discussed the Harvard Classics. My own dissertation focused on one of such series, the famous Everyman's Library, as Pantelis said at the beginning, launched in London in 1906 by the working class publisher J.M. Dent. And I want to place particular emphasis on Tessa's excellent observation about how American writers, often modernist writers, first encountered certain books, certain classics, through these accessible editions, and what that can tell us about the relationship between modernism and the mass market. D.H. Lawrence, whom we have frequently mentioned in our introduction, was an avid reader of Everyman's Library editions of canonical American literature. And perhaps another more interesting or even more ambivalent example is E.M. Foster's Howard's End, which strikes a blow on middlebrow culture by bringing a tragicomic end to the autodidact reader and clerk Leonard Bast, who dies crushed under a bookshelf, and who is reading what appears to be an Everyman edition of Ruskin's The Stones of Venice in the novel. And yet the fact that series such as Everyman or New York Review of Books Classics continue to be so widely read and consumed today testifies, we think, to the enduring vitality of packaged classics. Turning now very briefly to the cultural commentary section, despite working in different media and context, the literary text and the concert hall, both Robert Steptoe and Joseph Horowitz have illuminated how Black vernacular traditions have or could have revitalized and reinvented dominant forms of canonicity and expression in the American cultural landscape. Exclusion from the canon inevitably raises questions of class, race, and gender, issues that are also addressed in our poetry section through a reappraisal of the life and poetry of Emmy Klumpit and through David Lehman's original poems, which offer a welcome reminder that the classical tradition need not always take itself so seriously. Overall, having approached the question of what makes an American classic from many different entry points and perspectives, we hope to have laid the groundwork for further inquiry, work that must continue across geographical, linguistic, and disciplinary boundaries, of course. And we look forward to hearing from all of you today about your own encounters with the classic, with that small or capital C, how it has shaped your reading, your research, your creative practice, how it has been questioned, contested, or reimagined, how it continues to resonate or fail to resonate in different cultural and institutional contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kat. Thank you, Claire. Is this perhaps the moment that we want to open up the discussion to bring in the other contributors to the volume and to invite our attendees to communicate to us any questions or any comments they have via the Q&A button at the bottom of their Zoom window?
Nancy, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to drop you in it otherwise, Nancy, because you're well represented this evening.
Can't hear you, Nancy. Sound.
Oh, Rudessa can't hear us.
Can't hear Nancy.
I can't hear. I think Nancy has muted herself.
I was definitely muted, but now I am speaking, and I thank you very much. I felt like quite an outlier from the start, and so I just want to say that our project, and I'm one or two sentences, was mostly about how some uses of the classics are resistance, and in particular in the Medea project. And right now, I'm so ashamed of being an American that I'm much more focused on the American classic. And I feel that the play that her group wrote is about the Minotaur as the American healthcare system. And now with what's happening, it's happening. Everything that's in that play is happening from the government and being with the greatest cruelty on the poorest people. So is this different from America as it was? It feels that way, but maybe not so much. Listening to Glenn, I was thinking, well, it's been going on for a while. So thank you very much. And I always love working with you too. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Glenn, you appear to be mute.
Yes. Emily has also raised her hand, and I certainly don't want to.
Oh, I'll wait.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask Kat and Claire, you are at the beginning of your careers, and I think it's really extraordinary how you are combining erudition and courage in bringing this material out in the way you are. I want to ask you, what do you do next?
That's a very kind and generous question. Thank you very much. Well, we have presented on sort of, I mean, if you've read the journal, anyone who's attending, the introduction kind of goes in various places, but the sort of point of commonality that we both have is sort of looking at, in very kind of broad sense, kind of post-industrial revolution shifts in kind of massification and consumerism and what that means about the acquisition and dissemination of classical material. So we both presented on that at the CAAS conference in New Brunswick earlier this academic year, last calendar year. So there's special issues seem to be our thing at the moment. There's a special issue of coming out later in spring in 2026 by this point, where we'll be writing kind of as individuals rather than collaboratively on a similar topic. But yeah, I think, I mean, Kat will be able to speak to this perhaps better than me, but I think there is definitely a desire to keep that interdisciplinarity going. And I think an area that we have maybe underlooked so far is the way that the classic is understood in, and this is not just because, well, no, Wiebke's not here anymore, actually, so we can't even be accused of trying to pander to her. I do think that the notion of the Chinese classic is something that has cropped up quite a lot, and is something, particularly given that kind of educational boom and interest in utilizing classical narratives, I think something that we would probably want to loop in a bit more, if that's fair to say.
Yeah. And I think our plan is also to perhaps collaborate more with Wiebke and her team also of the Global Humanities Initiatives at MIT, looking at looking at the question, what does a classic do for different people in different temporal and geographical context? And I think also, of course, we want to keep kind of feeding some thoughts into the classical reception seminar at Oxford, which Constance and Pantelis have very successfully co-chaired. And I guess the value about these kinds of discussion is that they're always interdisciplinary, because they bring people with different undergraduate backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. And we've both spoken about, for example, the benefits of looking at the kind of intersection between book history and reception studies, for example, as methodologies, and what book historians can learn from classical reception practitioners and vice versa. So yeah, definitely that's the next step.
We should probably let Emily speak.
Good luck with that. Good luck with all you do.
Thank you.
I wanted to say first, thank you to the editors and the organizers. This has all been really stimulating, and I'm grateful. I wanted to think about the role of reading the classics in the formation of a political subject, kind of thinking of Glenn's mention of the midterms and Tessa's mention of phones and their prohibition, and to ask about the place of attention and difficulty and accessibility as kind of concepts in this discussion. And I think my question might really be a question for Susan, actually, because your piece was so helpful in just setting out the landscape of that particular phenomenon in education in the US right now. And I know you're coming at it from a background that has a lot of awareness about the concept of culture. And for Eliot in the Harvard Classics, he speaks very explicitly about that series as an occasion for what he calls hard reading. Reading that is diligent, that is attentive, that's that, just 15 minutes a day, but very consistently so, and very focused. So I wondered if you see this kind of current phenomenon of classical education in American politics as a kind of response to the current information environment, a response to a kind of larger collapse in reading practices more generally. And I wonder if within this kind of classical education, do classical texts actually become more accessible in a way? Does reading become more possible in that context than it may be for even students in my classroom when I'm teaching them the Odyssey in their first year of university. How do you understand the place of difficulty and attention in this kind of classical education is, I guess, my question.
Well, that's such a great question. Can I see Nancy's hand is up. Can I go ahead and respond to it or? Okay. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think you're really onto something there, that so much of the, when we're talking about the, children, the ones who aren't yet ready for college, then so many of the decisions about classical education are, of course, made not by them, but by their parents, who, like every parent, I think, in the developed world right now, has some concerns about these questions of attention. And I haven't really thought about that issue very much, but I think, you will probably not be shocked if you read my piece to know that I'm a little bit skeptical about the actual way in which this stuff is in fact, the classical education project is in fact marketed to parents to resolve any number of complaints that they might have about education, including the ubiquity of cell phones in public schools and whatnot. And that I am a little leery of saying, yes, that there is a kind of project here to recuperate students' capacities for attention and difficulty. And I guess this is also going to Glenn's and Tessa's comments just a little bit, who both, I think, aptly focused on hope. And I think that that's exactly right. And I too share your instinct that if there is a response here, or a kind of political pushback, it is in the creative capacities of readers of all ages who select and read in ways that are not determinable by the state or by their school principal or their teacher or whoever. That said, I'm verging a little bit from your question, Emily, so I apologize here. I think what worries me is that these kinds of pressures, which I've described as being ones of institutional and even infrastructural organization, are in fact designed to prevent those kinds of reading practices and creative encounters with the strange. And that's where I think, as we think about this, there's a pedagogical question of how do we produce those good readers of the strange and of the difficult. There is also an institutional question about how we organize and push back against the desire, frankly, to say that certain things are not readable. And I was going to update my piece a little bit and just remind you all that I had sort of anticipated that there was going to be some bad court decisions, Supreme Court decisions coming down the pike that made it much easier, for example, for charter schools to basically engage overtly in, that is publicly funded schools to engage in religious instruction. Some of that didn't come to pass the way people were anticipating, and I'm happy to elaborate if you want, but there was a pretty serious Supreme Court decision that happened recently that broke down the barrier between the separation of church and state by giving parents the rights to opt out of books that they deemed unacceptable based on their faith traditions. And I just wanted to sort of bring this up because seems to me a really classic example of the way in which something that is couched in the language of rights and freedom and options to read are in fact probably going to have the opposite impact, because schools being what schools are and classrooms being what classrooms are, it will mean that there will be less of these kinds of materials available to kids. just because of the pragmatics. And I think that that's sort of the area in which I sort of want to call attention to the significance of institutions in this whole thing. That sadly, the classics and what they are and how they are read are very much being determined by these larger structures. Sorry, I went on a bit long there, but I felt that maybe an update was in order.
Thank you.
Yeah, Faye, go for it.
Please.
Hi, I'm the dramaturge for the Medea project, Redessa Jones. Theater for Incarcerated Women. I've been that and played that role for the last 30 years. And in response to, first of all, the view of American classics, let's separate the icks from it and just call it class. Because there is an instance in which class is used as, or your education of the classics is used to put you in your place. So we are constantly, what is that? We're adding rungs to the ladder of who accesses the classics and how to make them more relevant and more personal as we live our lives in this country where there is definitely a class structure. I view the role of the Medea Project as that of the village shaman. That when there is a crisis, when a comet passes over and the village is terrified that the end of the world is coming, that the shaman's role or the artist's role is giving a vision to what that could be, that there is some cosmological purpose for all these things happening. And that we as a village must prepare, we must stay together, we must be prepared to move if we need to. So that our theater company is in that way a shamanistic practice in which we engage and use the classics as a tool to revitalize or reopen our way of thinking, especially with the bombardment of media, social media, the obsession with popular culture, which has nothing to do with reality, just with consumerism. And that consumerism becomes the goal versus an aspect that we have to survive as a community, as a society, as contributors to this country. So we exist, especially now, as a way to explore the use of the classics and turn around who originates the story or the theme and who is living it. So, for example, as Nancy talked about us doing the Minotaur this last year, we started with the healthcare system, particularly for African American women living in the Bayview Hunters Point. And if you're not familiar with Bayview, it is still an EPA Superfund site where people were there. The infant mortality is high, the rate of asthma is high, and so we worked our best to work within the community to get their stories, to start talking about that. And that the Minotaur is the healthcare system, because on the other end, you have a social group that is so challenged by their own health needs, and yet you have a system that can't provide for them because they don't have enough money. And now it's even worse with what's going on with this administration. Anyway, to cut it short, our current last theme, which we reworked the Minotaur and the maze and the use of Ariadne's thread. And we're going, I don't know, as the dramaturge, I said, I don't know what we're going to do with it, but I think we need something right now. And we were producing it. We started production the day after Inauguration Day. And so we had 3 months of observing what's going on with Trump. And the red thread, we were wondering what the red thread was and why it was so important. And we realized as we were going through these stories in which we contextualize them again in a theme of the red thread leading us out of being lost in this incredibly terrifying puzzle, that the red thread is the history of our resilience as a community and as a society. So that we how do you say, we owned it, we re-own the theme of that of Ariadne's thread, so that we not only contextualize it for their current situation, that we gave them a new urban related relationship to that myth, as we have in the past with Persephone and with what was the other one, Rodessa? You can help me.
Well, starting with Medea herself, you
Yeah.
know,
And the Fates, Moire.
yes, yes,
Unique.
sharing the whole idea of thinking freedom with
Yes.
Medea and just telling a group of incarcerated women the story of Medea and Jason, and women just being outraged at Medea. You know, she was this bitch and that bitch. I'm like, hold on. What are the ways that we're killing our children now?
Mhm.
And Marianne began this 30 years ago. You know, yeah, but no, it's been incredibly. Thank you, Faye, for being so open and clear about it. And thank you, Tessa. You opened my heart to a place in this. When you talk about Morrison, we deal with Toni Morrison all the time, and but you put it in that context of Ellison. You know, I just want to put this on top. I grew up in upstate New York as a migrant child. My father bought a farm, and all the farmers would bring us boxes of books of classics, Roman, Greek. But that was my introduction to classics. Was like these beautiful books and these pictures, and this is long before this is. I mean, I was like 12, and now I look back as Nancy and I are working on my handbook, and I'm trying to tell the story of I would like to have asked those farmers, what was this about in America that they were bringing all these beautifully handcrafted books and giving them to this colored family? And because I was 12 of us, the farmers would say to my dad, well, you have all these kids, they might enjoy them. And I look back and I go, well, where were they in the family? And why were now they're dropping them off at this farmhouse on this country road? So anyway, but it's been incredibly insightful. I just wrote a lot of things down, you know, like the human experience, and you know, because that's what also the Medea Project. We want to share with women everything, and I'm so glad that I met Nancy after she read about the Medea Project, and my life has never been quite the same, but you know, but it's wonderful that to be here and as Faye was saying about being the dramaturge and the whole idea of the Minotaur, what are we, Faye? We're doing our third iteration around the
Um,
maze now. We're still dealing with the maze, yeah.
we have to do this work in the middle of our own culture in society, because otherwise, what's the point for us for classics as a theater company, a diverse theater company working with the most marginalized people in our
Yeah.
society? How can we make it matter? So, by the way, Rodessa, your dad and my dad are the same thing. My dad, he had Bullfinch's Mythology and Robert Graves in his bookshelves. So, and my father worked as a cook in a migrant labor camp. So you don't know who has these books, okay?
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that, you know, just I feel like America, I've never felt in such a free fall as I'm
Mm.
feeling right now in this culture. You know, like what's gonna become of us? You know, and I think the whole culture sits back and we watch this madman uh run amok, and everybody goes, look at him, look what he's doing now, and it drives me crazy. Somebody had said about Democrats, I don't know what we can do. I hope we will survive the next 4 years, you know, and see how we come out with it. You know, I don't know. But I'm gonna have to sign off too, because I have a sister going into surgery. and Johari. But this has been incredibly clear. It's just incredibly insightful. I'm so glad I thought I was just gonna be listening in. I didn't think I'd have to have an opinion about something, but thank you all. Thank you all so much. And now Faye will talk more about the San Francisco grant, that whole thing, okay? But everybody be well, be safe, and I look forward to having the American Classic. I look forward to it because so much of this stuff began in the movies too. That was the other side. I just think about Pasolini's Medea, and seeing and Jason the Organizer being with my brother. And my brother who loves Spartacus, and he was like, "This is like Spartacus." It's like all of this was a part of my education and my acquaintance with the classics, and now to be an American classic, I guess. America, I love my country, but Lord, help us all. So thank you so much, and now I'm gonna skedaddle. Thank you so much.
So, well, thank you so much, Rodessa and Fe, for your very thoughtful comments just now. We are running out of time, and much as I would like to continue this discussion, I'm aware of the fact that there are people behind the scenes that have been keeping the whole session running, and I think it is only fair that we bring the discussion to a close. If there is one thing that I would take, if I had to choose one thing that I would take myself from this very rich and wide-ranging discussion, would be a sense of urgency to do with a number of different questions to do with the future of the classics, how the classics should shape the future. From where Claire and Kat should go from here to midterm elections, to the future of reading in institutional contexts, the future of the discipline. For me, there was something there that ran through many of the comments that say something about this particular moment and the context within which Claire and Kat have brought this particular issue to its readers. So there are many other things that I would like to be asking Claire and Kat about, but I think we will probably need to stop there. So as we come to the close of this special occasion, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank Florencia and Nelly for keeping the session going behind the scenes. To our respondents and speakers, thank you for your thoughtful reflections, generous words, and time. And to all our attendees, thank you for sharing this milestone with Claire and Kat. Please enjoy the rest of the evening and stay in touch. Thank you.